Elon Musk runs multiple massive companies, Tesla, SpaceX, XAI, all of them in very difficult industries. There's no doubt that he does a lot of things differently. Running that many large organizations at the same time is kind of unheard of. But there's one process that Musk engages in that is probably his most useful, and the one process that any manager, team manager, organizational manager of just about any size, from a small team to a large enterprise, can use and implement to improve their organization every day. And this is a tactic that you can use today. It's deceptively simple. So by the end of this video, you will understand the 5-step process that Musk uses and how this process will help you eliminate unnecessary work in your teams, why you should delete stuff until you've gone too far, how to apply these ideas outside of manufacturing, and one thing that you can try this week to get started. So what is the 5-step process? So at a very high level, the 5 steps are pretty simple. Question, delete, optimize, accelerate, and finally, automate. So let's walk through each of these steps one by one. So the first step in the process is to question every requirement. So most organizations' requirements and needs pile up over time, each one adding some bit of cost, time, and frustration. And it's often not clear as these requirements are added on what the real impact is, because we don't often have visibility to that. We're just adding on a little bit extra and think it's not that big of a deal. But when you add in thousands of requirements in an organization, it can grind everything to a halt without really anyone understanding why everything's been ground to a halt. This is extremely common. Our default is to add new requirements, new needs, new policies, new procedures. We rarely take things away in most organizations. Now, how does Musk approach this questioning every requirement? And there are some guides that he provides that are critical in any organization. One is you want to know who made this requirement. And this who made this requirement question is important because it's not about a department. Usually in most organizations, when you say who is requiring this process of us, you'll get a department name. It's legal, it's procurement, it's facilities. But you want an actual name, not a department. You want to be able to talk to somebody and interrogate that person so that you can understand, why does this thing exist? What is the point of this requirement? And you can't interrogate a department. You have to interrogate a person. Now, it's important to add here that oftentimes requirements come from outside the organization. So it could be a legal requirement, some kind of regulatory requirement. And so in that case, you want to understand 2 things. You want to know who's the person in the organization that owns this requirement. And there's always got to be some person who that's the case for. The second is you want to be able to interrogate the actual document. So if it's a regulation, you want to be able to read the regulation. Go get the actual regulation, read the text, understand what it says. You may find that it's not consistent with how the process is being implemented or the requirement being described. Maybe the requirement is being described in a way that's way overboard versus what's required by the letter of the law in the regulation. And so you want to name, and if it's an external regulation, legal requirement, you want to get that document. You want to understand exactly what it says. This also goes for internal policies that the company makes up, and you may have there's no individual anymore working for the company who wrote the policy, but you can interrogate the policy document. You can read it to say, what does this policy actually say? You want to be able to question either the person who wrote the document, but if you can't find that, you want to find the person who owns the requirement in your current organization, and you want to find any documentation that is the genesis of that requirement to be able to understand what is the real letter of the law. Let's not just accept what people say is the requirement. So let me give you an example. In most organizations, there are procurement processes and requirements for procurement. And if you as a manager want to buy something, there are rules that you have to follow in order to make a purchase. There's lots of rules. You might be shocked if you lined up all the requirements and rules in this process of just buying something. So let's say your organization has a process and a requirement that says if you're going to purchase something over $50,000, you need to get 3 competitive bids for the work. Now, you as a manager may know, if you've ever done this before, this is a big pain. It's a pain for everybody involved. It's a pain for you. It's a pain for the 3 companies that you're trying to get bids for. And it's a big process that requires a lot of work, a lot of formality, and maybe it's not as useful as people think in procurement. That's possible. Now, if you're going to question this requirement to understand why are we doing it, what's the purpose of it, you need to find out, well, who made it? And you may hear, well, it's in procurement. Well, remember, we don't want a department. We want a name of a person. So who's the person you can talk to? Who owns it? Who defined the requirement? Who owns the requirement today? And you may hear that that's like Bob in procurement. And then you need to go to Bob and ask him, what's the purpose of this requirement? What are we trying to solve for? What's the intent here? Why do we have it? Is it legally required? Where is the legal document? You can start to interrogate Bob. Now, you may get in a lot of organizations that Bob will say, well, it's a legal requirement. This is a very common thing. People love to shuffle off work to other departments, especially other departments that they suspect you won't go talk to. You'll just say, well, if you said the magic word legal requirement, so therefore I'm going to stop talking now. But you don't want to do that. You want to continue to drill down until you hit bedrock. Go to the legal department. Find out who the lawyer is. You'll probably circle right back around to Bob. You'll find out that this actually isn't a legal requirement. This is a procurement requirement that Bob or one of Bob's predecessors put into place, and it seems like it makes a lot of sense, and it's the quote-unquote best practice, and so it has really nothing to do with legal requirement. It's just Bob's process, which is fine. You just want to be able to get to the point where you've hit bedrock so that you know who you need to talk to. You're not getting kind of shuffled around in the organization, and you want to talk to Bob about why this process exists. You want to understand what the intent is. Now, in the case of 3 bids, you'll find something along the lines of that this process is in place to make sure that we get the best price, or we get at least a good price, and we don't overpay for work. And so that there's some process that avoids favoritism being applied to the spending of money that the organization has, so that you just don't hire your buddies to do all the work. And these things kind of make sense. They're logical. But you may ask, is there a different way to solve for this when you at this first step? Your opportunity here is to say, okay, if I just accept this requirement, that we need to have some requirement that avoids favoritism, how would I do that? Now, at this stage, you're just striving to understand the why. Why is this requirement in place? What is it trying to accomplish? One of the things that you want to question at this stage is there a way to solve for this that requires less time and less effort on the part of everyone? And for the pricing question and the 3 bids being able to get to a market price, you may ask procurement, is there a way that we can get market price data without having to go out and get bids? This is especially common for materials and equipment where there are multiple suppliers. You're not doing something very complex. You're just kind of buying software, you're buying tooling, and you can get market data that will show, well, the price that we have is within the ballpark of a market price. Therefore, we can pick vendors based on things other than just the bid. So this may be a way to achieve the requirement. You're not yet asking whether we should have this requirement or not. You're just trying to achieve it in the most effective way possible with the least amount of work, but still solving for the why. Why does this requirement exist? So that's step 1. Question every requirement. Don't just accept things because they're written down or you're told this is how we should do things. Now, step 2 is probably the most controversial of the 5-step process. And it's the one that gets the most media play whenever Elon Musk implements step 2 of this process in any of his organizations. And that is delete any part or process. So once you know the why, now you can ask yourself, do we really need this at all? The best process improvement is a process that doesn't need to be executed at all. Now, in the first step, you can ask, is there another way to solve the need? In this step, you're asking, is it necessary at all? Can we just eliminate it? Now, the challenge here is that everybody thinks that their process is critical. especially for specialist organizations like procurement or legal or facilities, these kind of functions in an organization. It's really rare that they're going to accept that you can just eliminate part of their process, because these processes and these requirements are kind of the reason they exist to some level. And so they're not going to say, yeah, you can just eliminate this process. It makes sense. So it's very difficult to get people to just admit outright that you can delete their process or delete their requirement. So how do you deal with this in practice if you really want to challenge a requirement? Well, in the first step, you know who to talk to. So you have somebody that you can interrogate and debate and understand and maybe override if you can politically or if you need to. But one trick is to kind of flip the script on how you're talking about these processes. So too many times when we have a process or a requirement, we start from the standpoint that the requirement should exist, and now we've got to prove why we should delete it, why we should eliminate it. But I found that you have a lot more benefit and you have a lot more success if you start from the standpoint that every process and every requirement should be deleted by default, and you force people to prove why it should exist in the first place. And this changes their mindset, where they're not forcing you to come up with all the benefits and why something should be eliminated. You're really forcing them to defend their position as to, well, we're going to delete this process. We're going to eliminate this requirement. That changes the process, the thinking process for a lot of people, to force them to defend why you should have a process or have a requirement at all. Rather than you having to defend why you want to delete the process. Just flip the script and see how far that gets you. Now, there's a corollary to this step 2 process, delete everything that you can delete, and that's the 10% rule. And this is a difficult one, a little counterintuitive, but it makes a lot of sense, especially in a knowledge environment where you're not building a physical thing, but you have processes that are knowledge work. And we're not building up some physical component. We don't have physical components and physical parts that we're talking about. And the 10% rule simply states that if you don't add back 10% from what you deleted, then you didn't go far enough. You didn't remove enough requirements if you don't have to go back and add 10%. So really you have to delete and go too far in order to go far enough. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, but it makes sense if we go back to what I just said about people don't want to give up their own processes. They won't accept that, yeah, you can just delete my process, you can eliminate it. So it's going to be very difficult for you to understand exactly how far you can go, how much you can reasonably remove from the process and still maintain the performance that you need, the protections that you need. It's not obvious. And so this idea from Musk is that you go a little too far and then you add back what you need to add back. And then you can be fairly confident that you're pretty close to cutting as much as you can reasonably cut from the process or from the requirements. Now, I want to make a note about this deleting parts and processes and eliminating requirements. It's important that some things are necessary for like safety or real legal requirements. So you don't want to, as a manager, be callous about this. You don't want to eliminate all process, but you really want to understand what's required and you want to understand the context of it. So now we're at step 3. We're midway through. So you've understood what the process is and why it exists, and you've talked to the actual person, and then you've interrogated it and tried to delete it and remove it. So step 3 is where you simplify and optimize. So this is where a lot of managers start. They try to simplify and optimize a process before asking, why does the process exist and can we just get rid of it? But if you've gotten to step 3 and you have what you have and you haven't found a way to eliminate it, or you don't think it should be eliminated, now you want to look at optimizing what you couldn't delete. You want to simplify what you couldn't delete. Now, there are 2 aspects generally, I think. One is what's the minimum required to accomplish the goal, and then having a rational design. Now, the minimum required to accomplish the goal is kind of the process or the components or the inputs into what you're doing. Is it the minimum required to achieve that goal? You don't want to gold plate, do a bunch of extra stuff that's not necessary to the goal of the process, to what the outcome should be. That's often a process mapping exercise, understanding what the inputs are, what's really required, what steps are required to accomplish the goal. The second part, rational design, is really a less obvious. And what I mean by rational design is if you think about any process that you're trying to simplify or optimize, and you have a process flow that you've outlined, there are all kinds of potential edge cases that you can map out. And most managers fall into this trap that they have to be very particular about what happens in all these edge cases. I want to define all the edge cases so that I have a process where whatever happens, there's a documented way to handle it. So there are two problems with this approach. First is there's no limit to the amount of edge cases that could exist in a standard process, much less a very complex one. And so you could have a process document or a process outline that is super complex and super detailed and large, which means nobody's going to follow it. Nobody's going to look at it. It's going to be pointless. It's going to look good on a screen. It's going to look very impressive, but it's not going to be useful in the day-to-day aspects because it's just too much information. It's too heavy. The second thing is you're now outsourcing the judgment of your people to a document or a process flow. And this is a problem because what you want to do is you want to inculcate your judgment in your team so they know how to deal with edge cases on their own rather than having to go to some document, which they won't go to, by the way, to understand what to do in this case or that case. And so when you optimize and simplify, you actually want the simplest process you can define for the bulk of the cases. And then for everything else, rely on educating your team about what your judgment would be in this situation or that situation. And the more you look for ways to be able to update the judgment of your team on your thinking, here's why I would do X in this situation, you'll find that your processes need to be less and less defined because people understand and can bring judgment to bear on all the edge cases. And so instead of having to map out 80% of the possible permutations, now only about 50% of them need to be mapped out. And you can give kind of general guidance on where your thinking would be in this case or that case, what the intent is around the process. And so the point about optimizing is to simplify not only the process itself, but also any kind of documentation that you're doing around the process. You want that to be simple so it's useful, and then rely on judgment of people for all these edge cases. And this is why the first step in the process, understanding why this requirement or this process exists, is so important, because at some point you need to be able to explain this to your team, assuming you haven't been able to delete the process thus far. The fourth step in the process is to accelerate it, increase the speed. This is really critical for a couple of reasons. One is that if you increase the speed of a process, you increase your learning cycles. The faster the process goes from beginning to end, the more cycles you can achieve. You can learn more each cycle and improve bit by bit. You can do that much faster. It's very difficult to improve a process that is 6 months long, because by the time you get to the end of that process, nobody remembers what happened in stage 1 when you're at stage 99. So improving the cycle time, meaning decreasing the time it takes from beginning to end of a process, is a great way to increase learning and eliminate a lot of non-value add activity and time in a process. Now, it's surprising to a lot of people, especially in knowledge environments, that the bulk of a process, the bulk of the time from beginning to end, is actually wait time. There's nothing happening. It's not uncommon for most processes to be 90, 95% wait time, where there's nothing happening. So you as a manager, when you get to this stage, you want to eliminate wait time aggressively, because it's a lot more painful than you may realize to have all these wait states in the organization occurring. So you want to be super aggressive about eliminating as many wait states as possible to have things move through the cycle as quickly as possible so that you can learn how to improve the process and create that flywheel. Okay, so now we're at the end. The fifth step is automate. So only when we've understood why this requirement or process exists, we've interrogated whether we can delete it or not, and assuming we haven't been successful. Then we're optimizing and simplifying it. Then we're accelerating it, especially removing those wait states, increasing our learning cycles, and increasing the velocity of learning that we were able to have within a process. Now, the final and end step is to automate. So whatever we have left from step 1 through 4, and we're comfortable and we're pretty happy with what's happening, then we can look for ways to automate the process. Now, other than the most common area managers just jump into a process like this is the third step. They start to map out the process and try to optimize a process without asking, why does it really occur? What's the point? And can we just eliminate this completely and not do it? The second kind of most common entry point is to automate. They just assume, well, this is the process, this is what it is. Let's figure out how to automate it, get the humans out of the loop so that at least we don't have to manually do this process anymore. The issue with automating something that shouldn't exist is you're just increasing the velocity of failure. And things are rarely as automatable as you think. There's always a human in the loop or the automation breaks. There's just a lot of work that's required, even if it might help if you completely automate it. So at this stage, you've got a process that's as lean and mean and as required as a process could be in your current environment. Now you want to look at, okay, now we can automate this. Now, one common thing about the automate is when you get to this stage, you've done all the work of optimizing and simplifying and reducing the cycle time. You may find there's really not much to automate anymore. It's not worth the effort to automate it because there's so little left in the process. That's actually not a bad place to be. But if you still find that there's a lot of work and effort in a particular process or to achieve a particular requirement, then you can look at ways to automate this process. And today there's lots, we won't go into them in this video, but AI is improving that landscape a lot, allowing automation in areas that really were really difficult before, but have become increasingly possible with AI tools. But you always want to leave this to the last where you automate. You've automated something that's kind of proven its worth, and you've simplified it as much as you can simplify it. So in the beginning of this video, I mentioned some of the companies that Elon Musk is involved in, and they are, for the most part, heavy manufacturing companies. You know, Tesla and SpaceX are building big things, rockets and cars and batteries and solar panels and all this stuff. These are physical things. And so some people might think, well, this process that Musk uses is heavily weighted toward the physical. And there's a famous image from SpaceX of the rocket engine that they designed and the three versions, or at least three of the versions of the rocket engine. And the first version of the rocket engine is enormously complex. And as they move through to the third version, it's super simple looking. It looks super sleek and futuristic. There doesn't really look like there are any parts on it, any moving parts at all when you look at the engine. And this shows the progression of deleting components and requirements in a manufacturing setting where they take something that's super complicated and difficult to manufacture, no doubt, and difficult to maintain, and they delete until they get an engine, a rocket engine that looks like almost like there's nothing there. It just looks like some kind of funnel, but it does the same thing, even better than the more complicated, more highly engineered version 1 of the rocket engine. But in non-manufacturing environments, in knowledge environments, I think this process actually is even more powerful because in our knowledge environment, bureaucratic creep exists everywhere. And unlike manufacturing, it's difficult, if not impossible, to see all the waste sitting around. All the requests that haven't been approved that are sitting in inboxes. It's not a pile, a physical pile that we can see, oh, we have a bunch of old rocket engines or old parts, and we can see those parts, and we know what we paid for those parts, and we have to pay for a building to store those parts. All those costs of waste are pretty obvious in a physical manufacturing environment. They're not at all obvious in a knowledge environment. And so this kind of process of forcing the organization, forcing other departments, forcing yourself as a team manager, for example, to question the requirements, to question the process, to simplify, optimize what you can't delete, and finally to accelerate and automate what's left is really critical in non-manufacturing environments. And each individual process or requirement in and of itself doesn't cause a problem, but all these things compound and end up slowing down the organization, making everything a little bit more difficult bit by bit. But if you add up over years of this, it makes organizations very difficult to operate, very inflexible, and we have to change that mindset. And so I think this 5-step process that Elon Musk has used primarily in a manufacturing environment, these simple 5 steps, they're difficult to implement and do in real life, but it's simple theoretically. These 5 steps are probably more important in a non-manufacturing environment. So what's the next steps? Like, what do you do now? Well, you as a team manager could pick one requirement you want to question this week. Find the person behind it. Ask why. Understand what's the necessity of it. What's it trying to accomplish? See if you can remove it. See if you can map the process end to end to improve the process, to simplify the process. Can you rely on the judgment of your team? Is there a way to move to a point where your team can exercise more judgment rather than having a process that's too rigid, too heavy, too unwieldy to really meet the needs of your organization or your team going forward? So you could just question one requirement, one process, and see how far that gets you. Maybe you'll be able to delete it, maybe not, but at least you'll understand why, what's the point, and how does that requirement or that process interface with your team. You can just start with small things that are related to your team specifically. Improve the local area, mow your own grass, and don't worry so much about solving all the world's problems and making your whole company improve. Just improve the life of your team, free up some of their resources to be able to tackle whatever the next thing is, the important value-adding thing that they currently don't have time to do today because they're dealing with creating reports that nobody reads or following a bid process that makes no sense. But I'm confident that you'll find a lot of waste, a lot of stuff that shouldn't exist, because this is just the default way of how things accrete over time in organizations, and nobody questions why they exist and force them to be removed from the organization. So this allows you to build time back in your team and your organization to tackle the next big thing, whatever that big thing is. Or it just makes your life easier, which is also not a bad outcome. Now, comment below if you have a process that you're trying to tackle or you have a specific question. And if you are interested in other ideas about how especially team managers can improve their team and deal with the corporate environment, subscribe to the channel.